It started with a sudden flash in the dark, an unexpected light flickering outside my window at 1 a.m. I live alone on a farm in Indiana, miles from the nearest neighbor, so any sign of movement at that hour is a reason for alarm. As I stood on my porch, rifle in hand, watching that eerie glow bob around near the old barn, I knew this wasn't a simple case of stray headlights or kids playing pranks. Something was out there, and I was about to find out what. The farm had always been quiet after dark, with only the sounds of crickets and the occasional owl. My wife and I had lived here for over a decade before she passed away last year. Since then, the big old house felt empty, even more so at night. I spent my days trying to keep busy with the usual farm chores, but nights were harder. And lately, things had been getting strange. The light near the barn had first appeared a few nights ago. At first, I thought it was a trick of the eye, maybe a reflection from some distant headlights or a neighbor's porch light. But the nearest neighbor was miles away, and no road came close enough to cast such a precise beam. It moved too, like someone was carrying a flashlight and searching for something. I didn't wait long to find out what it was. Grabbing my rifle and flashlight, I made my way cautiously toward the barn, keeping my eyes on the flickering light. It went out just as I got close, plunging the yard into darkness again. I swept the area with my flashlight, but nothing seemed out of place. The barn doors were locked, and all the equipment was right where it should be. For a moment, I stood there, listening to the silence. The only sound was my own breathing, loud and quick in the still air. I felt foolish, convincing myself it was just my imagination, so I headed back inside. But in the back of my mind, a small voice kept whispering that something wasn't right. Over the next few nights, I saw the light again. Sometimes it was at the far end of the field, sometimes closer to the house. Each time, it vanished as soon as I got near. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it had to be some local kids messing around. But the uneasy feeling only grew. One Friday night, I was watching TV when I glanced out the window and saw it, this time right at the edge of the yard, too close to ignore. I stormed outside, rifle at the ready, but as always, the light vanished. As I turned to head back inside, something upstairs caught my eye. The window to the bedroom my wife and I used to share. The bedroom light was on. A chill ran down my spine. I hadn't set foot in that room since she passed away, and there was no reason for the light to be on. My heart pounded as I climbed the stairs, feeling like each step was pulling me deeper into a nightmare. When I reached the door, I paused, listening for any sound. Nothing. I threw open the door and froze. The room was exactly as I had left it, except for one thing. The lamp on the nightstand was lit. A photo of my wife and me was slightly tilted, the only sign that anything had been disturbed. As I stood there trying to process it, I heard a creaking sound from the hallway. I turned quickly, raising the rifle, but the hallway was empty. My pulse quickened as I checked each room, but nothing seemed out of place. Just as I was about to go back downstairs, I heard something outside. Leaves rustling near the barn. I approached the window cautiously and peered out. The light was back, flickering near the barn, but this time, it felt different, almost like it was watching me. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, unable to look away. Since that night, the light has appeared almost every evening, always near the barn. I've stopped going outside after dark, keeping all the doors and windows locked. But I can't shake the feeling that whatever's out there is getting closer each night. Sometimes I hear faint footsteps in the hallway or whispers through the walls. I can't explain it, but I know I'm not alone on this farm anymore. The laughter came from inside the dark, deserted mall. A high-pitched giggle that sent a chill down my spine. Standing by the rusted, broken entrance in the dead of night, I knew the mall was supposed to be completely empty, its doors sealed shut for years. But that sound, echoing from the halls, was unmistakably human. Gripping my flashlight tighter, I pushed the old door open, the hinges groaning as if warning me to stay away. Inside, the darkness seemed almost alive, and I realized with a jolt of fear that someone or something was not alone in there. This abandoned shopping mall had once been the town's main attraction, but it had been closed for years after business dried up. The entrances were chained up, the windows boarded over, and the whole building was surrounded by a tall, rusty fence. My company was contracted to patrol the perimeter to keep out vandals and squatters, but nothing ever really happened here, until a few months ago. Residents had started reporting strange noises coming from the mall at night. Laughter, footsteps, even voices. My supervisor didn't believe it, but he sent me to check it out anyway. I arrived at the mall around midnight and the place looked like something out of a horror movie. The wind was picking up, making the fence rattle and the boarded-up windows creak. I walked the perimeter with my flashlight, checking for signs of a break-in. Everything seemed normal, just a lot of darkness and silence. I was about to call in an all clear when I heard a faint noise coming from inside. It was hard to pinpoint, but it sounded like footsteps echoing through the empty halls. I stopped and listened, telling myself it was just the wind or an animal. But then I heard the laughter, a giggle, high-pitched like a child's. I gripped my radio and tried to call it in, but all I got was static. The radios never worked well around the mall, so that wasn't a surprise. Still, I couldn't just walk away. I found a side door that had been pried open at some point. It was old and rusted, but it swung open easily when I pushed on it. Inside, the air was musty and stale, with a lingering smell of mold and old wood. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing empty storefronts and broken fixtures. I called out, expecting some kid to jump out and laugh, but there was no response. I ventured deeper into the mall, checking each corridor and listening carefully. When I reached the old children's play area, something caught my eye. A piece of paper lying on the floor. It looked out of place in the dusty environment, as if it had been dropped recently. I picked it up and saw several hastily scrawled words. "They won't let you leave." I felt a chill creep up my spine. I turned to head back, but that's when I heard it. Footsteps coming from somewhere behind me. I turned off my flashlight and crouched behind a row of abandoned arcade machines. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, echoing through the empty halls. My heart was pounding, and I tried to keep my breathing steady. The footsteps stopped right behind the machines. I could feel someone standing there, just inches away from where I was hiding. I shut my eyes, praying they wouldn't notice me. After a few seconds, I heard a faint whisper, barely audible. "Run!" I didn't hesitate. I bolted out of the play area and ran for the exit. I burst through the door and didn't stop running until I reached the fence. When I finally looked back, I saw the door slowly swinging shut, as if someone was trying to trap me inside. That night, I filed a report, but my supervisor dismissed it as just nerves and wind. They sent another team to check the mall, but they found nothing. I refused to go back there, and from then on, I avoided that route during my rounds. The locals have their own stories about the mall, whispers about a child who went missing there decades ago, and rumours of strange shadows moving through the halls. Some people think it's just an urban legend, but I know what I heard. And sometimes, when I pass by the mall at night, I still hear faint laughter echoing from inside. I grew up in a small town in Oregon, surrounded by a vast forest. That forest was almost like my childhood playground. My friends and I wandered through the trails countless times, looking for small animals or fishing by the stream. As an adult, I moved to the city for work, but every summer, I made sure to return to my old home for a few days of peace and quiet. This house originally belonged to my grandparents, and many of my childhood memories are tied to their yard and the woods. The old house sat near the edge of the forest, where the sound of leaves rustling in the breeze was ever present. After my grandparents passed away, I inherited the house. I rarely came back to live here, but I could never bring myself to sell it. It wasn't just a house, it was a part of my past that I couldn't let go of. This summer, I decided to return to the old house for a few days of vacation. On the first night, everything was as usual. I set up a lounge chair in the yard, drank a cold beer, and watched the sun slowly sink behind the mountains. As the evening darkened, I headed back inside, but suddenly remembered that the storage room behind the house might be leaking. I grabbed a flashlight and went to check it out. The storage room was on the back side of the house, close to the forest's edge. I opened the door and checked everything to make sure it was fine. As I closed the storage room door and was about to head back, my flashlight beam accidentally swept across the woods, briefly catching a distant light. It didn't seem like moonlight. It was more like some kind of artificial light. It flickered deep in the woods. I frowned, trying to recall. This forest never had electrical installations, nor did anyone live out there. Driven by curiosity, I walked toward the light. I crossed the yard and entered the forest, the leaves crunching softly underfoot. The light wasn't far, and I quickly approached it. As I got closer, I saw that it was a tent surrounded by a mess of scattered items, like someone had temporarily set up camp. Through the half-open zipper of the tent, I could see some simple camping supplies and a small lamp still glowing inside. I called out, "Is anyone there?" but received no response. Looking around, I felt a growing unease. People rarely visited this forest, especially at night. I was about to leave, but something drove me to step closer to the tent. I carefully unzipped it, thinking I might find someone who needed help. But instead, what I saw was a journal. The journal was placed near a pillow, and its cover was yellowed with age. For some reason, I picked up the journal and opened it to the first page, which contained brief notes, apparently written by a camper. But as I read further, the notes became increasingly disorganized, and the content grew stranger. I know they're watching me. Every time I close my eyes, I can hear their whispers. The last few pages were filled with chaotic scribbles, as if the writer had been too terrified to express themselves clearly. A chill ran down my spine as I closed the journal and stood up quickly. I scanned the area, feeling the atmosphere grow increasingly heavy. I hurried back to the house and locked all the doors and windows. Back in my bedroom, I placed the journal on the desk, but the unsettling sentences lingered in my mind. I tried to convince myself that it was just the ramblings of a missing camper. However, that night, I slept uneasily, feeling as if something was watching me from outside the window. The next day, I reported the situation to the local police station, and they promised to send someone to investigate. They combed the forest thoroughly but found no trace of a tent. The officers told me I might have been mistaken, but I was sure of what I'd seen. On the third night, not long after I had fallen asleep, I was suddenly awoken by a soft tapping sound. It was faint and intermittent, coming from somewhere outside the window. I sat up in bed, straining to listen. The tapping became clearer, as if someone was gently rapping on the glass with their fingertips. I walked over to the window, carefully pulling back the curtain to peek outside. In the moonlight, I saw the tent standing at the edge of my yard. I distinctly remembered that it had been deep in the woods. How could it have suddenly appeared right in my backyard? My heart began to race. I grabbed an old hammer by the door and cautiously opened the back door, heading towards the tent. The beam of my flashlight wavered as I approached. I unzipped the tent again, but this time it was empty, except for a mess of blankets that looked like someone had left in a hurry. Then I heard rustling behind me. I spun around to see a shadowy figure among the trees. My flashlight beam swayed, illuminating the tall trunks, but the figure remained just out of reach. Suddenly, the tent's lamp went out, plunging the surroundings into darkness. I felt a wave of icy fear and hurried back to the house, locking the door behind me. For the next few nights, I couldn't sleep. I kept listening intently for any sounds from outside, convinced there were countless eyes watching me. Whenever I closed my eyes, I could hear whispers that seemed to come from the depths of the forest. I began to suspect that the journal wasn't just the ramblings of a disturbed mind. Perhaps I was slowly succumbing to the same fate. One night, half awake, I felt something moving in the room. I opened my eyes and saw a faint glow outside the window. It was the small lamp inside the tent. I reached for the journal, feeling a strange dampness on its cover, as if someone had recently flipped through it. I knew I had to leave the house, but even after moving away, I couldn't escape the whispers. They seemed rooted in my memories, following me wherever I went, always whispering from afar. Now, I never returned to the old house near the forest, and that tent, no one ever found it.